Does it mean that I can say the Holocaust was a good thing and appeal to people to go at that? If you don't recognize that there are two considerations, then you're just blinding yourself to the reality. And you may give a reason that powerful people, if there is such a thing as restricting speech, powerful people will overdo it. Very possible, very possible. But I mean, this is just one of those very important lines you have to draw with great care.
And now, The Good Fight with Yascha Mounk.
For our British listeners, I'm excited to announce that Persuasion is hosting an in-person panel event in London, which I will be speaking at. I will be joined by journalist Ian Dunt in a conversation moderated by the journalist and broadcaster Rashmi Lal, and we're going to be talking about the American election, trying to make a prediction about who wins, though I don't have any idea, to be honest, clearing up some myths about the American electorate, and of course, discussing the stakes, discussing what America will look like the day after the election and over the course of the next 4 years. All of this is on Tuesday, October 29th at 6:30 p.m. at the Sackford Pub in Farringdon. That is Sekforde, the Sackford Pub in Farringdon. Tickets are £10 or they're free for paying members. The link to the event on Eventbrite is in the show description, in the notes for this podcast. Alternatively, you can also go to persuasion.community/p/events. That's persuasion.community/p, like persuasion/events. I hope to see you in London. My guest today is one of the most distinguished living philosophers. Charles Taylor is Professor Emeritus at McGill University and has won major intellectual prizes, including the Kyoto Prize, the Templeton Prize, the Berggruen Prize. He is the author of many books, including A Secular Age. We talked today about the breadth of his philosophical work, trying to make sense of how we moderns or we contemporaries think about individual identity, how our notion of identity differs from the past, and how it relates to the importance of group identities. We talked about the ways in which we now live in a secular age and what kind of role religion can and does and should play in our society. We talked also about post-liberal critiques of liberalism, about whether the charge that it is impossible for people to be truly religious or devout in a liberal society is true. And finally, we discussed more contemporary issues from cultural appropriation to freedom of religion and laïcité, to hate speech legislation in Canada and other democracies. After our main conversation, Charles and I also had an additional chat about how to get to the age of 92 and still be so intellectually engaged and so lucid in the world. We talked about his abortive political career, running for the Canadian Parliament on a number of occasions in the 1960s, including against Pierre Trudeau, or as Charles put it, including Pierre Trudeau running against him. And I asked him a question that I've always wondered about, which is, to those of us who don't naturally take to the philosophy of Hegel, why is it important? Why should we try again? If any of this intrigues you, please become a paying subscriber of the podcast. Please listen to these extra parts of the conversation. Charles Taylor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So a lot of your work is about questions of identity, democracy, and diversity. It's about questions of who we are, how that shapes our lives and its meaning, and what that means for the kind of institutions that we should adopt. At the origin of that, perhaps, stands your account of how the way we think about identity has transformed in the modern age. What does the concept of identity actually mean, and how is it that we think about what our own identity is in very different ways to what we might have considered 100 or 500 years ago?
That's a very, very interesting question because it's kind of crept in unobserved. When people talk about my identity or his identity today, and they want to spell it out, what they very often are doing is spelling out the most fundamental benchmarks by which they live their lives. So that when they're trying to make a very difficult decision or articulate what their values are, right, they reach towards that. So it might be a religious faith, it might be belonging to some nationality, it might be a whole host of things. And we could have asked somebody about that, let's say in 1940, and we wouldn't have used the word identity. We would say, well, what's the really important fundamental things that allow you to make decisions in life? So what happened? And what happened was partly maybe Erik Erikson and his very interesting books on identity. But I think what happened was that the idea grew and very powerful, coming from the Romantics, that everybody has their own identity. It's different from person to person. And also that somehow we have a very important role in defining what it is. I mean, a lot of it is there, but we have to sort of articulate it. And that change, particularly the idea that we have something to contribute to interpret it, is what accounts for the shift from asking people about what's fundamentally important to you to asking people about their identity. Or, maybe people ought to have what's really important to them respected as against people ought to have their identity respected. So it's a kind of introduction of a certain element of self-interpretation into this, which goes along with the idea that everybody is different. There are fundamentally different identities that no two people have exactly the same identity because, in my case, it's I who have contributed to the interpretation. In your case, it's you. So this is a very Herder type idea, romantic type idea, that everybody is different. Everybody has their own fundamental view on life.
That's very interesting. I always thought when I was at university and, a lot of my classmates had done gap years in, places like India to find themselves. And I always thought, what made you think that you lost yourself in India such that you can go to India to recover yourself there? But it seems to speak a little bit to this kind of notion of identity that is both individual, that you have to construct, right? You have to engage in work in order to uncover it. But it's also somehow already inherently there in the world. It is there for you to be discovered. How do you view that concept of identity? What does that concept of identity get right? What of it should we retain? And what aspect of it do you view critically?
Well, I think it's right for us. I mean, there are these big differences that occur in history, big changes that occur in history. Erik Erikson, I don't know if you know his work, he wrote a book on Luther, and Luther's called Young Man Luther, and he interpreted it very interestingly as Luther trying to discover his identity, going through the agony about finally, yes, it's only salvation by faith and so on. And that's very interesting because there was something really totally anachronistic about that. I mean, if you'd gone to Luther in 1517 and said, poor Martin, you've suffered from an identity crisis, well, I'm glad you're feeling better. You would have, you would have had, a slap in the jaw. It would have been inconceivable because there are no differences of personal identity. The really important things are this or that, salvation by faith or salvation by works or whatever. And human culture changes. People change in history. And we now live in an age where, anyway, in Western society, but it may spread, in which people conceive the fundamental issues in a key, if I can use this musical expression, in a key in which there's an individuality here, and you have to discover it. You have to find out what's really important for you. So I think that in one way we've always been doing this. I mean, you could get stories from way back about people finding out that what's really important for them is this, and they thought their parents kept telling them something else, and now they realize it's this. But now it's against the background of, in a certain sense, having to be original, having to be different, having to be something special. And this is just our culture today.
How does this concept of individual identity correspond to the role that groups and communities play in our society? The modern, and in some sense the liberal, notion of individualism has often been criticized for somehow being at odds with the importance of social links and social networks, or inimical to the valuation of the influence that groups play in our lives. And I know that an important theme in your work that perhaps we'll come back to in this conversation is how democracies and institutions should, recognize the importance of groups in people's lives, and make sure that they have an ability to thrive. But if anything, the rise of the internet and of social media seems oddly to have valorized identity, and particularly understood as group identity, rather than dissolved it, as we might have expected 30 or so years ago. So how is it that this romantic notion of the individual that has to both be found and constructed, that is really separate from the identity of everybody else? You have your distinct identity that is not identical to that of somebody who happens to share various attributes, such as being white or male or Christian and so on. How does that then coexist with what seems to be not just a very substantial importance of groups and communities in contemporary life, but in some ways, in the last few decades, perhaps even a growing importance of groups?
Well, yeah, because I think that for a lot of people, going back to the fundamental question here, which straddles the historical gap, what's really important for you? For a lot of people, that is their belonging to this religion, their belonging to this nationality, and so on. That doesn't cancel this modern individual twist, because you could say that, and anyone could say, to me, being, let's say, Canadian, it means something different from the person down the street who's also got the same passport, right? But it could nevertheless be something terribly important. And if somebody turns around and says, all Canadians out, or Canadians are inferior, or whatever, I sense that what's really important for me, core of my being, is being disrespected, right? And that, I think there's no contradiction between the idea of I put a certain spin on this, but it is the belonging to this group that really is important to me.
It seems to me that there may be a little bit of a contradiction in the way that people talk about it, at least. Perhaps not at the deepest philosophical level, but there is at least a tension, let's say, between a culture that says, there was the culture in which I grew up, and I'm a couple of years younger than you, where what is it to be an individual is to go find yourself, is to construct yourself, is to think, what are you interested in? What are your values? And that's the kind of background culture in which people could unironically say, I spent a year in India to find myself.
Yeah.
And that does seem to me rather different from some of the culture that I see many of my students nowadays come from, where from elementary school through middle school to high school, they were in some ways encouraged to think, my identity is the particular intersection of group identities I stand in. The way to find myself is not to, go to India and perhaps do some drugs and have a spiritual experience that's sort of orientalized in weird ways. It's to go to the affinity group of Asian American students at this high school, and it is to define myself by my sexual orientation or by other kinds of ways in which I slot into a landscape of pre-existing group identity. So I get that these two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they do seem to stand in tension in the way that people tend to think about how to construct the sense of self.
Well, not really, because for one thing, the idea is today that just because I am born an X doesn't mean that being an X is really important to me. Maybe something else, right? So the idea that I have to, this idea of the individual input could be put in terms of a notion of ratification, right? I am, like it or not, a Canadian, or I am, like it or not, a male of a certain age, and so on. And then how do I react when people say that Canadians or males of this age are something very despicable, right? Well, it could be that although I am that, it's not really vitally important to me. So, yeah, I say, so what? But if it's the case that I'm really deeply identified with this, if I've ratified that, then I feel deeply insulted, deeply hard done by. And I think there's a certain amount of people, in a way, looking around for ways in which some feature of themselves is being depreciated and devalued, and then, as it were, turning their lives around and making that the cause of fighting against that. I think there's a certain amount of that going on in our society, because it's something a bit noble about being a persecuted minority, and therefore you want to valorize it. But the element of ratification, as I'm calling it, is always there.
So what does it take for that kind of ratification to take place in the right way in our culture and perhaps our institutions? When you talk not just about ratification, but the importance of recognition, what is it that it takes for particularly, identities that might belong to a minority group to be, ratified or recognized in the right ways?
Well, I mean, it's almost always defined in relation to a kind of looking down on, or the kind of discrimination or a sense of inferiority that a lot of people have of this particular identity, right? So it's always framed in terms of rectification of a discrimination, right? Not so much in terms of recognize me, but stop de-recognizing, stop, putting me in the shade. And I think that's a tremendously important part of the modern liberal culture, that there's a sense of guilt for having over years discriminated against certain kinds of people. I mean, think of gays. People today are horrified when they read what people said 40, 50 years ago. How could they possibly say anything that absurd, that ridiculous? This is where you see the importance of identity in a new way, because they're not being seen as deviant in their sexual life from the norm. They're seen as people who refuse recognition. And there's a whole theory behind this, which we bring in, the idea that we really essentially need some kind of ratification from outside of our identity, right? And to withdraw this or deny this is to do some terrible harm. So the big issue becomes, am I recognized, or am I constantly placed in some kind of shadow area which people disapprove of or look down on, and so on?
Thank you so much for listening to The Good Fight. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Now, I know from the numbers that some of you listening right now are paying subscribers to my Substack or to Persuasion, and I'm very grateful to you for that. And yet you are currently listening to the free version of the podcast, the version that has ads that can be annoying, the version that doesn't include the bonus material at the end of this week's conversation, for example, and the version that makes you miss out on our bonus features like the new monthly mailbag in which I answer your questions. So if that is the case for you, you can fix that by doing one of two things. Either you go to the last email you received from me, because hopefully you're subscribed to my Substack, the last email about a podcast, and you click on Set Up Podcast and you follow those instructions. Or alternatively, you simply navigate to the following webpage. Head to yaschamounk.substack.com/listen. That is yaschamounk.substack.com/listen. And if you don't get this content per email as well, you're missing out on my weekly written columns about big ideas. In the last few weeks, for example, I've had a series of articles about how to evaluate effective altruism and the 4 big myths that are misleading people in how to think about the current election. So go add the private feed of this podcast, become a paying subscriber if you want access to that content, And be sure to receive my weekly written essays in your inbox as well. Thank you for listening.
So let me perhaps distinguish here between two forms of that kind of recognition might take. And the first, as you're saying, is it's a kind of double negative, right? It's the absence of a negative judgment. It's a non-deprecation of some form, right? It's that you can be open about some aspect of your identity. And of course, some people have a choice to reveal certain aspects of identity, others don't, right? But you can be open about the fact that you're gay, or you can move in the world as somebody who's Black, who obviously is, under normal circumstances, immediately recognized as being Black, without that leading to some form of deprecation, without your interlocutors saying, well, if you're gay or if you're Black, then I'm not going to treat you in the same way, or I'm going to have negative views of you, or I'm going to think of you as some kind of social inferior. That, I think, every member of a liberal society can agree on, or at least every person who's themselves a liberal in the philosophical sense will agree, yes, of course, we shouldn't deprecate our fellow citizens for being gay or being Black or something like that. But when we talk about both social practices of recognition and some of the philosophical demands for recognition, it can go beyond this double negative to a kind of positive command, right? That I should affirm your identity, that I should express not only that I don't deprecate you on the basis of that, but that I, in some important ways, value that identity. And I guess I have two questions here, which is, firstly, where does that start to interfere with my own liberty to hold views and thoughts about the world, right? Like, where might it be that if I think that you, for example, put too much emphasis on your ethnic identity in a way that contravenes my view of what kind of importance we should give to ethnicity in general in the world, the demand on me to recognize your ethnicity in a certain kind of way comes to limit my appropriate freedom of thought or speech or worldview. And secondly, where does that start to box people in, right? At what point is a demand for positive recognition one in which I'm being encouraged, when I see that you're gay or I see that you're Black, to treat you as a gay man or as a Black man in a way that might actually impede on your liberty to say, those are true identities of me, but that's not what I define myself by. I have a more individual identity that is not in its core derivative of that group identity.
Yeah, I mean, there can be this kind of exchange back and forth in which people alter their view. I mean, somebody could be, let's say, Black, and certainly think that slavery was terrible and the inferiorization of Blacks was terrible, but they don't want to identify with people, other people who are Black, who are making this so central to their identity that they're not feeling themselves also, members of this or that society. And but I mean, that is part of the back and forth that is implicit in this, right? They can come back and say, yeah, Black, and it's terrible that there's been discrimination, but what's really important in my life is this or that cause or whatever. And so don't put me in a box. And people very often do say that, don't put me in a box. But I think that the issue which is hiding behind all this is not coming out to the fore, is if you take it from another angle, which is it would be a much more enriching society if all these different identities, whether strongly felt or not, you could sort of come to understand what they're like from the inside. And then there's something immensely enriching about that experience, that somebody is not just blankly different and you're not interested, or even you have prejudices against them, but that you can learn something from these other cultures, these other conditions, and so on. And I think that is a very common, or much more common intuition among very much younger people than us old folks, or even you, not, who already attained a certain age. It's very, very common that they find this experience enriching of getting to know people who are very different. And that begins to put these whole set of issues in a completely new light. And I think that's also what is behind, I think, Martin Luther King or John Lewis. the idea that they're trying to communicate their vis-a-vis, I won't say interlocutor, but their vis-a-vis, bull color with the fire hose. They're saying, look, we would live a much richer life if we stopped this ridiculous set of prejudices and we began actually to exchange with each other. So you're damaging yourself and say you're narrowing your lives by going on like this. John Lewis has a wonderful expression, put down the burden of hatred. It's a burden to always think you're superior and you have nothing to learn from them, and we can exist on another footing. Now, this is in some sense, very utopian or very far-reaching ambition here, but it's a suggestion that we change the whole way in which we relate to each other, because it would be a much better way of life, a much fuller way of life for everybody. And I think that's a very important choice, which can be there in the background all the time, just alongside.
I don't usually think of my age cohort as a particularly important part of my identity, but let me engage in a little bit of generational chauvinism here for a moment, which is that perhaps you're right that older generations are not open to that kind of exchange with and learning from other cultures because they grew up in less diverse societies. So, when I look, for example, at your generation of Canadians, I think it actually is astonishing to what extent many and perhaps most of its members have seen, a radical transformation of their country from, a very predominantly white Christian society to a much more diverse society. And I think on the whole have grown to be comfortable with that and on the whole have come to find things to love in that. But let's say that there is younger people, perhaps of my generation, this is the chauvinism coming in, but are very predisposed to that, that grew up in societies that already were significantly diverse, that were quickly diversifying, and in which the background culture and the norms of the main institutions were ones that were encouraging us to engage in that kind of cultural exchange in a self-confident way. We're saying it is good to enter into that kind of cultural dialogue. You should be tolerant in the ways you were saying. I mean, your little soliloquy a moment ago sounds in a sense like the norms that my generation inherited. I do wonder whether the youngest generation has actually faced a rather more mixed message, one that on the one side emphasizes the beauty and importance of things like diversity, but at the same time started to problematize and warn them about those things. That said, even if you encounter somebody with good intentions and you are a person who thinks of themselves as open-minded and tolerant, you might very easily commit microaggressions against them that actually are a form of white supremacy, right? A form of racism that is undetected within you and that is going to grievously hurt them. And so you should be very careful about how you interact with people. Or in another notion, that what you and I might think of as a positive form of cultural exchange can quite quickly turn into a form of cultural appropriation. So you should be very careful about what you take from the cultures of your fellow citizens, because you might in fact inadvertently be stealing from them in ways that are wholly inappropriate. So what do you think about a notion like cultural appropriation? Do you think that that is impeding the kind of mutual encounter and cultural exchange that we should value in a multicultural society? Or do you share the concerns that that those forms of cultural exchange can easily lead to perhaps inadvertent forms of oppression and injustice?
Yeah, no, I think there is such a thing as cultural appropriation, but I think people are very often vastly too fast to as it were, identify it when it isn't there. Really, it's not that, I mean, you can imagine that you take credit for in talking to people from other continents for certain things realized by Aboriginals in Canada, but don't ever let on that this is something that, Aboriginals themselves have produced and so on. Yeah, but I think people are very often just much too sensitive to jump on that, and it does impede this real open exchange. I mean, what's really necessary in this case, let's talk about the case of Aboriginals, because very often they're the ones who make this complaint. It's the people who are genuinely interested and quite moved by certain features of Aboriginal spirituality and so on. They don't need to be doing anything that could be called cultural appropriation. They are seeing this culture in a quite new light, the way it wasn't at all seen by our European originating predecessors. So I think that there's always going to be that kind of hypersensitivity on the part of one or another, which will impede the conversation. But the conversation must go on. And if it goes on with a real mutual respect, it can't do anything but improve things.
Let me change gears a little bit and ask you about a strain of your work that is very important and that I, as a person who's quite secular, who wasn't raised in a religious tradition, sometimes have more trouble accessing, and that's your work about religion and secularism. The title of one of your most influential works, A Secular Age, sounds straightforward, right? When listeners to this podcast will hear that title, they can say, well, of course, I mean, church attendance is down and religion plays a smaller role in people's lives. And of course, we live in a secular age. And they might be picturing a book with all kinds of statistics about church attendance and responses to, Pew surveys and so on. But what you mean by a secular age is a little bit different, I think, from what people might imagine. And it contains, as I understand it, the claim that even people who are quite religious today, even people who do go to mass regularly or who perhaps pray 5 times a day, are secular in a way that would have been hard to imagine a few centuries ago. So what beyond the statistics about church attendance or how many, what percentage of Americans or Canadians or Germans say that they believe in God, what makes this age a secular one?
Well, I think there's more than one thing. I mean, one very important thing is that religion is no longer at the center of the identity of states. Whereas if you look a couple of centuries before, even less than that, in Europe, say, that hasn't been the case at all. In Germany, some of the mini-states of the Holy Roman Empire were Calvinist, and others were Lutheran, others were Catholic, and that was the way it was. And there are very few that managed to sort of balance a number of different religions. Now it's the norm that the state is not aligned with any religion. So that's one very, very powerful feature of secularity. But in the book, I said that there's another one, which is that our whole set of understandings about religion have shifted. And what's become really important to lots of people is, if you like, spiritual search, finding some kind of meaning, some of which could involve some elements of religious faith and so on. Others not, but some yes. And that has meant that the practice of religion continued practice of religion has been really changed. And it's been changed in an interesting and sometimes very trying way, that for people who very strongly want to hang on to their religious identity as it was conceived before, right? And people who are approaching that religious identity as searchers, there has arisen great mutual misunderstanding and even hostility, right? So for some, being Catholic involves no change at all in the particular ethical, and so on, and total belief in infallibility, whatever, and so on. And they double down. And because they double down, precisely because people with the other tendency are challenging that, right? So we're living in an age in which religious identities, we can use this word again, religious belongings, are polarized. And it's very interesting and disturbing. It's not just true in Christendom, it's also true in Islam, right? And it's also the case that there's the possibility of kind of religious war has not been put aside at all. On the contrary, there's people who belong to this, we use the French word intégrisme, this integral bloc, who would be glad to enter into conflict with others. This is visible in the Islamic world, that the more, as it were, Salafist than it is, the more one's ready to go out there and fight against your own minority, fight against Europeans and so on. So it's a very complex situation, very unfortunate in many respects, but it's that kind of alignment versus the old days in which it was just about saying that if you're a North German, you're a Protestant, that's a transformation. That's why I use the word secular age. It's an age in which the whole positions of religion and non-religion and so on are fundamentally altered. The aim of the book was, it was very simple to see secularity as just religion declines, and disappears altogether. But that's not what happened. What happened was decline, but also new forms. And I wanted to try to describe what actually happened.
I had a debate recently, a friendly conversation with a Chinese sociologist working on religion. And she made a claim that I heard a few other people make in a Western context as well, that our societies are in fact much less secular than meets the eye, and that they reject ultimately the idea of secularization, because even though perhaps religion has less institutionalized power, the heads of most Western democracies, at least, don't claim to be speaking with religious authority in the way that heads of state may have done in the past. And perhaps people are less engaged in certain forms of organized religiosity. But these people claim actually, all kinds of forms of spirituality still shape the lives of contemporary citizens, from China to the United States to Western Europe, in ways that are irreducible. This seems to me both an important footnote on the story of secularism, something that contains a grain of truth that is interesting and goes against our assumptions in a way that deepens and complicates our thinking about the world. But also ultimately, I just don't quite buy it. And yet I found myself at trouble to respond to these points as effectively as I might. It's very much not my field. So what would you respond to those claims that say, well, perhaps our societies are much less secular than they seem, and to therefore characterize our age in its essence as one that is secular is actually misguided?
No, I think that you can do that if you ignore a lot of the phenomena of today's spirituality, because it's certainly the case. If you remain fixated on those who are total members of churches defined as they were 100 years ago or 150 years ago and so on, this is not the dominant. I mean, it's the minority, I would say, in our present Western society. But you have to ignore the whole development of very diffuse and very different and very, very diverse in their expressions of spirituality that are here. That, if you just leave that out, that's fine. But if you want to describe the scene as it is, the kind of choices people have, the way that they relate to these choices and move in and out of them and so on, you have a very moving, that's one thing that's clear, you have a very moving picture. I mean, every time you look up, something different is there. But I stick by the description I offered in the secular age. It seems to me to be correct. And what will come later, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure the only thing you can be sure of is that it will surprise us. I mean, if we live that long, to see what happens next.
One of the criticisms that's often made of philosophical liberalism specifically, but the basic principles and institutions underlining contemporary liberal democracies more broadly, is that they're somehow inimical to certain substantive philosophical views, and particularly to religious ones. And, you hear this critique formulated nowadays in the form of often devoutly Catholic post-liberals on the right, within places like the United States, where they claim that somehow the supposed neutrality of liberal institutions, the supposed openness to all forms of life and all conceptions of life, actually systematically undermines the ability of traditional communities, of religious communities to persist, and favors a form of radical self-experimentation that is inimical to those communities. One post-liberal that I interviewed on the podcast claimed that liberalism is really the maximization of autonomy, and as such is irreconcilable with religious communities. You also, of course, see that claim made in a sense, for example, by Salafists, right? So there's also a form of Islamism which claims that it is impossible to follow the commands of Allah in the right way in a society that is corrupted by Western mores in general. I'm skeptical of that critique, right, as somebody who's a philosophical liberal, but I wonder whether part of your description of what it used to be like to live in a deeply religious community can help us understand and excavate it, which is to say that you didn't have to be religious as a choice. It was such an imminent feature of all of social life that it was quite different in nature. From the perspective of your understanding of religion and the secular age, how much credence do you give to the complaints of these various forms of post-liberals who say that our institutions appear open to them and appear, claim to be neutral in a way that accommodates them, but that they actually don't?
No, I think those claims are not always, but very often, either in bad faith or, there's a desire on the part of people who are in this kind of, I wish we had a word in English to translate intégrisme, the Catholicism intégral, the people who believe that you have to buy the whole package, right? Well, let's say integrism, that people who are integrists have a desire to lash out. I understand it, but it's very unfortunate. So they have a desire to find cases where they're being coerced. So you get, and particularly in the United States, is this true? So you get these, I think in the end, kind of crazy cases of somebody who's asked to make a cake for a wedding between two gays and so on, and who says, I have the right to refuse. Really, even if they're forced to make the cake, it's hardly a grievous denial of their ability to practice their religion, particularly as the religion concerned is supposed to make people exercise charity in relation to each other. So I think these are, particularly in the United States, these are kind of people with a chip on their shoulder that are just waiting to find an excuse to lash out. You took that chip off my shoulder, I'm going to get you. And of course, they have the First Amendment on their side because the First Amendment has a clause against the establishment of any religion, but against the restriction of the free exercise of religion, right? It's very interesting that the cases that occurred on the First Amendment in this part of the First Amendment in the States are almost always free exercise cases, and in some cases justified. But in a lot of cases, they're picking a fight. They're picking a fight to make a point, is my view.
So this is the masterpiece, what's called a masterpiece cake case or something like that. Again, as somebody who's myself very, very secular, I think I have a slightly different read of that case, and perhaps it makes for an interesting question about where the line does and should fall. I absolutely agree that we need to have public accommodation in the United States and every liberal society, right? Even though in general we have freedom of association and freedom of commerce, I should not be able to say, my shop offers general services and you walk in and on the basis of some important identity characteristics, I don't let you in, right? You are of a particular ethnic group, so I'm not going to sell water to you in a drink store, or, you're gay, and so therefore I'm not going to sell you these shoes. That I think absolutely a liberal society has the right to require, but if you are a place that is generally open for business, you cannot refuse custom on the basis of those kind of identity characteristics. What was at issue in this case went a little bit beyond that, right? Because they didn't just want a general cake that this bakery always offered, right? It's not that I walk into a bakery and I say, you sell pound cake, I would like a pound cake. And they say, no, I'm not going to give it to you because you might serve it at a gay wedding. What they wanted is a cake that is customized, right? Where, there would have been two figurines on top that represent the couple that is getting married. And they would have engaged in some kind of process of customization in order to tailor this particular cake to this particular wedding. And there does seem to me to be plausible that I obviously disagree with the substantive views of a baker in this case, they would be compelled to exercise some form of speech in making that cake, right? That in making that cake, they would in some ways be endorsing the importance of the union of this particular couple. And that they have religious views that make that difficult for them because they believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. They would in some ways violate their ability to remain true to those beliefs. So, again, even though I have no sympathy for the underlying views of this particular baker, it seems to me that the Supreme Court may have made the right decision here in drawing that distinction between general forms of commerce and forms of commerce like baking a cake or like doing a portrait for somebody or other kinds of forms that involve a form of artistic expression and therefore a form of compelled speech, in which case I think the people doing that should be able to refuse it. Just like if I was a photographer or portrait painter, I would want to have the ability to refuse to photograph a wedding of people who I deeply dislike for personal or political reasons, or because I find that they have extreme political views or something like that.
I'm not deeply interested in fine legal distinctions, but that's probably good law. I'm just wondering about the psychology of the people who are so exercised about how this, particular arrangement of pastry will be seen by the, it would be quite in keeping with their faith, I think, to say, well, that's their business. We'll certainly express our view that it isn't our view. Or I don't know if they refuse I don't know what actually happened in this case, whether they refused to do the cake or whether, they were forced to and they wanted to make a case against it. So I haven't followed that. But it seems to me in the practice of one's religion, it sounds to me at the level of, trivia to make a big fuss about that. And the motivation is there in certain, I can understand the motivation in a way because you'll feel very disappointed that things aren't the same as they were in Grandpa's day and so on. But I think that a large part of this motivation is backlash against that, the actual motivation.
So more broadly, what do you say to the critique that, the institutions of liberalism are facially neutral and they, aspire to give the same rights and freedoms to each group, but in reality, it shapes a culture that pushes people away from community and pushes people away from religiosity. And so what appears on the surface as a set of neutral institutions that is supposed to accommodate religious minorities, for example, in reality sort of eats away of the social preconditions for their existence in such a way that they are now battling this kind of existential fight. I mean, this is how I understand the kind of post-liberal critique of liberalism, as well as some communitarian critiques of liberalism that perhaps are closer to the philosophical tradition that you're in certain ways sympathetic to. So to what extent do you think that kind of critique hits the nail on the head, and where does it go wrong?
Well, it's not, the thing is, it can't be the business of society in a modern age of diversity to be promoting one or other of the options that people make, very profound options that they make. Of course, that can, in a certain sense, fragilize, if that's an question, certain options. But it also can be the basis on which certain options are adopted. I mean, that there's no compulsion in this area. No compulsion in religion, to quote from the Quran. No. It can be an invitation to develop my own spiritual sense. Yeah. So, I mean, it's just a fact of the modern world that there is this diversity, and that diversity prevents or relegates to the past the kind of totally unreflecting belief that, this religion is the right religion. The thing is, I lived through the transition. I'm old enough. I was brought up in Quebec before the Second World War. I wasn't very old, but and I remember the kind of totally clerical society that we had in French Canada. I was very much embedded. My family, is partly Quebecois. So I know what the atmosphere was like in those days, and I know the kind of benefiting from this of certain political leaders who presented themselves as ultra-Catholic, and their way of doing that was leaning hard on religious minorities in order to get votes. And it is terrible irony for me today to see that the same kind of politics is being carried on in the name of what's called laïcité in Quebec. And again, discrimination is being justified and is really used as a selling point in politics for a certain notion of secularism, which is, I think, very, very discriminatory in its conception. So, why am I giving you this bit of autobiography? Because I want you to understand that I really understand what was wrong with the previous situation in which everybody was X, Y, or Z and had to be X, Y, or Z. I lived it. I didn't suffer myself. I mean, it was a family that was very, very multi-religious, if you like, and no one persecuted anyone. But I looked out from this safe haven and saw what was going on in the society, and I'm je suis irrécupérable for that kind of society.
Yes, I mean, one of the obvious ironies of particularly the Catholic form of post-liberalism that is put forward by some people in the United States is just how radically out of keeping it is with any realistic idea of how American society works. I mean, it's always tempting to think, when you consider free speech, for example, that censorship would be just fine if I were to be the censor and I were to be, to get to decide what can be said and what can't be said. But this is sort of an extreme form of this, right? Where, people who engage in a minoritarian interpretation of a minoritarian religious denomination within the country somehow think that, the answer to all of the ills of our present political condition is to overthrow liberalism, and then imagine that somehow they would end up being in charge. And, not only, I think, is there good reason for those of us who don't follow this particular set of religious ideas or practices to fear that kind of society, it's also just deeply naive of them to think that that's what would happen. So I agree with you on that. You just invoked a little bit the French concept of laïcité, and we spoke earlier about the First Amendment. The way in which Anglophone societies, and particularly the United States, think about freedom of religion is, rather different from the way in which French society thinks about freedom of religion, and perhaps Quebecois society. And that is a kind of historical set of roots, right, in which the United States faced the problem of people with very different religious convictions, for mostly Christian, coming to these shores and thinking about how do we ensure that these different kinds of communities are allowed to flourish under these new circumstances. And something like France or Quebec faced the problem of one overarching religion dominating its political space to such an extent that you needed some form of proactive freedom from it. But the question was always, how do we ensure that this set of religious practices doesn't dominate and colonize our society, but also our political institutions to such an extent that it doesn't leave any space for anybody else? That has led to quite different ideas of how to understand freedom of religion. And, I have a preference in certain ways for the American one, but I also find that Anglophone observers often caricature the French tradition of laïcité in ways that are unfair, both because they don't understand the historical impetus behind it and because they exaggerate the extent to which it's intolerant of religion, of other religious traditions. What do you think is the right conception of freedom of religion in a liberal democratic society? And what should we think about these contrasting traditions in the Francophone and the Anglophone sphere?
Well, the first thing to say, though, is a, bémol there. The French traditions, there was a majority view in 1905 in the law of separation of church and state, which was very militant, radical one. And they had reason to be, because there was a big movement to reestablish a Catholic monarchy. There was a threat to the Republic. But there was another minority trend in the coalition that passed those laws, which was mainly supported by Protestants and Jews, where they said, no, the only problem is discrimination. If we're all equal before the law, then the options are equal. And those have been running together in France, in its culture. And it's only very recently in France. I remember before the turn of the millennium, I remember lots of cases where people were demonstrating discrimination against Algerian youth. Of course, partly due to football, because the members of the team that won the World Cup, a lot of them were Algerian youth. And then around the turn of the millennium, it shifts, and you get these laws. Kids, girls can't wear the hijab in school, and then they tighten the laws more and more. Mothers can't wear the hijab if they accompany the school kids on some, school excursion. So it's got worse and worse. And why has it got tougher and tougher? Well, I think there's reasons, deep sociological reasons, to do with France's relation to its Muslim minority, which comes from the Maghreb and is a very important part of the population, which is terribly discriminated against and is sometimes rioted, and that's produced kind of very ugly reaction on the part of a lot of French people, particularly Madame Le Pen is an example, right? And so we get this hard line laïcité has come back in France to be part of the legislative picture, but just in the last 20 years, 15 years, 20 years. So there isn't a French tradition. There are French traditions. And the people I intellectually respect, people like Jean Boubireau, are the ones who stick by that other one, the one that said, well, what we need is laïcité, liberté de conscience. The state is neutral, and people's conscience is free to choose their religious or non-religious path. And they don't suffer discrimination because they do one rather than the other. So back to Quebec, we're always justifying that we're doing this because France is doing this, but it has unfortunate similarities, right? We've done certain studies, the very discriminatory law of the government, Law 21. If you ask people two questions, what do you think of Islam and what do you think of the law? It's clear. The people who really dislike Islam, 100% for the law. The less you dislike Islam, the more you're against the law. So we're dealing with a discrimination which is driven by discriminatory feelings. And of course, the spread of Islamophobia in the Western world doesn't need to be pointed out. And this kind of law is not laïque in the sense that it should be laïque. It's a weapon for discrimination on the basis of very strong prejudices of part of the population and pretty unscrupulous politicians who want to surf on that. And I would make the same case in France. And it's really to a Francophile like me, I'm talking about France, c'est navrant, it's terrible to see France descend into this kind of mutual division and disdain for its minorities and so on.
We spoke about the difference in how the Anglophone and the Francophone sphere talks about freedom of religion. Let me tease out another difference that is interesting to me, which is related, obviously, and it's the difference between the United States and Canada, for example, on the conception of free speech, where in the United States, the First Amendment protects a far-reaching notion of free speech, which makes it basically impossible for the state ever to punish or imprison people for things that they say, certainly when it is a matter of political expression. In Canada, as well as many European democracies, you've had the introduction of quite far-reaching hate speech laws over the course of the last years and decades. And according to a new piece of legislation, but as we're recording this, is pending in the Canadian Parliament, the Online Harms Act, I believe it is called, there could be prison sentences of up to 5 years for various forms of hate speech and possible life imprisonment for anything that is considered incitement to genocide. How do you feel about these two different political traditions? Is there virtue in the more absolutist defense of free speech in the United States, or do you think that there can be a justification from within liberal or communitarian grounds for the kind of hate speech legislation that many other democracies have adopted in the last years?
Yeah, no, exactly where you draw the line is very, very, very difficult, and I understand the kind of dilemmas one has drawing the exact line, but that there are these two considerations which are very important: freedom of speech on one hand, and the possibility of speech being used to arouse hatred and even sort of encourage harm to other citizens, that they need to be taken into account. I have no doubt. It's not you can't simply say one of these as it were, decide every issue, but drawing the line is tremendously difficult. That I certainly agree with.
I guess the argument that defenders of free speech would make, and I would count myself among them, is to say, well, precisely because drawing the line is so hard, we shouldn't be in the business of drawing that line, which is to say that in reality, this just becomes such an exercise of political power that it is simply going to enshrine the views of the dominant majority over everybody else. And by definition, I think especially on college campuses, the idea has often been that various forms of speech code are going to protect vulnerable minorities because we're assuming that the people who are going to be in charge are always going to be on the side of progress and enlightenment and diversity and so on. But certainly at a moment in which some less than tolerant political forces are doing very well in opinion polls and having a lot of power in parliaments across the Western world and beyond, it is simply naive to think that the people who are going to be charged with drawing those lines are somehow going to be on the side of the vulnerable and marginalized. Nearly by definition, they're going to be quite powerful, right? Because they need to have the power to be in those positions in order to do that. And sometimes they may happen to be tolerant, but often they won't. So what would you respond to somebody who's defending a more absolutist American conception of free speech that says the only way you can actually ensure that people are able to speak their mind, and in fact, the only way you can protect vulnerable minorities against forms of political domination is to not be in the business of drawing those lines?
Well, what I say to that is you're just not looking at the reality. There are two very important requirements here, right? Does it mean that I can say the Holocaust was a good thing and appeal to people to go at that? I mean, is that if you don't recognize that there are two considerations, then you're just blinding yourself to the reality. And you may give a reason that powerful people, if there is such a thing as restricting speech, powerful people will overdo it. Very possible, very possible. But I mean, this is just one of those very important lines you have to draw with great care. But it is a line between different considerations. This is what we have in life all the time. I mean, you could say that sometimes, welfare, if it's overdeveloped, it can give money and help to people who should be able to help themselves. This is what the Republicans are always saying in the United States. And yeah, undoubtedly that's true. But the answer of forget welfare, I'm sorry, there are really important human needs here that have to be met. Where exactly I'm a social democrat, I draw the line very different place from American Republicans. But I think we all have to recognize that there is a line here to be drawn, and we can't just escape from it by saying, there's no other consideration. I think this is a kind of political reasoning, which is very common in the United States, but which I find, absurdly uninteresting to follow.
Charles Taylor, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
In this week's bonus content, I asked Charles Taylor some personal questions about how in his early 90s he is still so lucid and philosophically active, about his abortive political career in politics, what it was like to take on Justin Trudeau's father in the 1960s. And finally, something that I have struggled with since the beginning of my intellectual life, since my time in college, which is how do you make sense of Hegel's political philosophy, and why is it important even though to many of us it is so obscure? If you want to have access to that really interesting part of the conversation, please become a paying subscriber today. Please go to yaschamounk.substack.com and support this podcast. Thank you so much for listening to The Good Fight. Lots of listeners have been spreading the word about this show. If you too have been enjoying the podcast, please be like, rate the show on iTunes, tell your friends all about it, share it on Facebook or Twitter. And finally, please mail suggestions for great guests or comments about the show to goodfightpod@gmail.com. That's goodfightpod@gmail.com.
This recording carries a Creative Commons 4.0 international license. Thanks to Silent Partner for their song, Chess Pieces.